Welcome to We Have a Spiritual Problem, where we ask the tough questions about faith and what it means to be spiritual in our modern world. I'm your host, Jeff Armstrong. In this episode, I'm joined by my friends Griff and Sandi Griffin. Griff is an atheist. Sandi is a Christian. She would say a lapsed Christian. They've been married for 30 years. In this episode, we explore the multifaceted nature of spirituality, modern beliefs, and the challenges of navigating differing views within a marriage. We discuss the definitions of spirituality, critique institutional religion, and share personal experiences that have shaped our beliefs. If you are a believer, non-believer, or someone who is simply questioning what it means to be spiritual, this episode will have insights for you to consider. Well, Sandi and Griff, welcome to this newer podcast of mine. We Have a Spiritual Problem. My frequent listeners and viewers on the Aging Well podcast will know Sandi because she's been a regular guest and a great promoter of that podcast. But Griff, you're new to my podcast. You two, obviously, I think it should be obvious to the viewers and listeners that you're married. Welcome to being, how many years?
30 almost. September.
Wow, 30. That can't be possible. Did you guys get married when you were like your middle school?
22.
That's still pretty young, especially when I was like 39, I think, when I got married. So, but I welcome you both. Why don't we start off before we kind of dive into the deeper questions? Just have you guys kind of give a little brief introduction to who you are.
Yeah,
Sandi, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I'm Sandi Griffin. I obviously have, like Jeff mentioned, have been on the Aging Well podcast. I'm in the fitness industry as a profession, but I was also in the spiritual realm. I grew up in a Lutheran church as a kid and was involved with all the things. My mom was very involved in the church and was a worship leader for nearly 20 years. And kind of stepped away from that for a few various reasons, but view my faith as a little different than what typical Christianity looks like now. Just life experiences and being married to my partner who is my best friend and everything to me, but has very different viewpoints. So we, from 30 years ago, had to kind of come to like an agreement where we could meet on mutual ground. So it's been a really fun 30-year journey.
Great. And Griff, how about yourself?
Griff, retired Air Force, did 21 years as a medic. Spent most of that time overseas. Now I'm still serving the government as working for the Space Force as we're standing up that service. So, and then as far as spirituality, I've never really believed in a God, the traditional God that the Christians and Muslims or anybody else believe in. It just doesn't make sense in my brain, but I believe in just more of like karma, treating people well, kind of, I wouldn't say Hindu, but kind of some of those philosophies that they have.
So that kind of leads into my really first question is, how do you both define spirituality? Because it's easy, I had students in the past when I've been teaching wellness, and I bring up the spiritual dimension of wellness. And I had a student once raise his hand and said, well, I don't believe there's a spiritual component to wellness because I'm an atheist. And I'm like, well, I will disagree with you. But, that'll be kind of the conversation today is, where does that spirituality fit into all this? But how do you both define what it means to be spiritual or what spirituality is? She's pushing it to you. The harder answer comes to the harder person.
I think for me, it's just being good to other people, just being part of that space of, appreciating our planet, the earth, other humans, and just taking care of what we have. I guess probably my easiest way to explain that in my mind.
We'll dive into that a little bit deeper too. But Sandi, how about you?
I feel like spirituality is not so much a belief in a person, but a belief in something bigger than ourselves, whether that be reverence for, like, kind of along the lines of Griff saying, reverence for our creation, reverence for us as human beings and as purposeful beings. I would truly believe every person has a purpose on this planet. Revering the earth that gives us life, the sun and our food is grown, on this planet, our water, everything. I think it's just a reverence for the things that are bigger than we are. And an acknowledgement of the things that are bigger than we are.
And that's how I define it. I mean, historically in this podcast and really for years talking about, well-centered fitness, as I would call it, or my friend Jay labeled it as SPIES, spiritual, physical, intellectual, emotional, and social. The spiritual piece, I think, is bigger than religion from my perspective. It's that there is something bigger than self. And so for somebody who doesn't believe in a deity, a god, gods, goddess, whatever force, whatever you want to label it, I think it's possible for us to be on the same page because, if there's an absence of something greater than self, what's left? Only self, and that's like complete narcissism. And so, Griff, I think we're probably on the same page when we talk about, what spirituality is. And I think in many cases, religion just kind of gets in the way of that. So what are your thoughts on that? And we'll have to dive into how you two managed 30 years together with what might seem on paper to be divergent views, but I'm guessing is really not that divergent. It comes down to maybe a little bit of practice as opposed, or lack of practice rather than really a deep belief system. What are your thoughts? I'm going to let you guys talk a lot today, so I'm going to sit back and let you guys talk.
I think for me, it's just to be blunt, I'm kind of disgusted with the Christian churches in general. There's a lot of talk about doing all these things, helping all these things, but I look at it from a business perspective and I see how much just greed and wealth goes into these churches. I really saw it right after we first got married. We had our kids going to the school at the church, and every week, Sandy was playing music, so I'd go occasionally just kind of be supportive for her. But every week I would go, and it was all about money every time, so they could build more schools, so they could get bigger, so they could get more people, so they could get more money. And I was just like, I don't care for this. It makes me uncomfortable. I would go 5 or 6 times a year, and tithing was always the topic. Even when we went to other churches, and their pastor's like, if I find $1 on the street, I'm going to give my 20% to the church. I'm like, and that kind of stuff is kind of really what puts me off. And I just don't see them doing all the good stuff that they talk about. They take care of the people in the church, part of the people that are part of their clan, but not the rest of the world. I don't really see that kind of. So that's kind of where I had to step back. I'm not comfortable in those spaces, and I didn't want to go. I knew she was. So when we first got together, it was important to her. We just had that conversation that, it's not important to me. I'm going to support you to go. And we've had multiple discussions over the years about religion and, discussions about tithing, and, she was wanting to give a bunch of money, and like, you're spending 10, 12, 15, 20 hours a week, giving to the church. That time is worth money as well. So, you need to look at that value of what you're giving. So we had a lot of those conversations. And then with our kids, it's like, you can take them to church until they decide they're old enough and they decide they don't want to go or they do want to go. We just need to leave that decision up to them. So it was an easy balance for us. It was, Sundays you go do that. I'm going to clean the house or do whatever I'm going to do.
Well, that's a win-win for Sandy.
I know, right?
She goes to church and comes home to a clean house. Clean soul and a clean house, right?
Yeah.
So, Sandy, where's your thoughts on all that?
Yeah, it was an easy conversation for us to have, and at the time, and we'll get into that later, but my views have changed quite a bit. But at the time, it was important for me to make sure that my kids knew, had a foundation of faith and had a foundation of who I believe our Creator is. And I wanted to make sure that they at least had that introduction. Baptism was important to me at the time. And so we had a discussion about that too. And and he was like, well, that needs to be their decision. And I'm like, but, and different churches have varying views, whether it's a believer's baptism or it's an infant baptism. And at the time we were at a church that believed in infant baptism. And I said, if the kids decide not to believe in God, this is going to mean absolutely nothing to them. But if they do decide to have a faith in God, this will be very important to them. And there's always an opportunity if they choose to do a baptism because they now hold that faith as their own. It wasn't just me doing it because they were a baby. Then they can do that as well. So it's still going to be their decision, but this just makes me feel better about being a Christian parent at the time. So we had great conversations, and it was actually pretty easy.
Yeah.
Well, okay, the podcast is over. It's easy to be So were there any struggles at all in terms of, trying to balance your marriage with your, I don't want to say conflicting views, because I'm not hearing that they were all that conflicting per se. It was just the idea of institutional religion for one, but not the other.
Yeah, no, I don't think it was. Once we got over the tithing discussion, that was a big sticking point for me. So once we kind of settled on that, and she realized her value with that, I was able to step back and go, okay, now we're in a good place. But then when she started leading the worship team, which she did for 15 years while we were in Germany, that kind of got under my skin a little bit, because every week she was there. So we're living in Europe and we can't go anywhere on the weekend because she's there every week leading music, and that was a little bit of a source of contention between the two of us.
Yeah.
She's picking music on Tuesday, practices on Thursday, and then gone all day Sunday. So it was just, that was a bit of a struggle, to be honest.
Yeah.
Was that,
and that's where a lot of my views started changing. Was during our time in Germany. It was a non-denominational church, and as a worship leader, you're responsible for everything. And if I'm gone, I'm the lead vocalist and lead instrument. And, everybody else couldn't, especially on the holiday weekends when we all had the long weekends, military gets an extra day off, plus the federal holiday. And, of course, everybody else disappeared. But because I was the leader of that ministry, I had to stay. And so, and it wasn't just one thing. It wasn't just that. It was a culmination of different things. And this is where my view of religion versus my faith and my spirituality really started to change shape. Part of it was recognizing, the church that I started with was just a little tiny community church. They just rented out this old kind of warehouse building. It was very humble beginnings. But by the time I left the church, it had grown significantly. There were paid positions. I was not one of them. It was like, and I just saw a lot of what people, I think, speak a lot of is the hypocrisy of Christians, the humble brags, the I'll pray for you, thoughts and prayers, that kind of stuff. The lack of actual love and servitude towards one another, especially people that didn't belong to the church. I really started seeing a stark contrast of what was being taught, but what was being actioned. And that really started turning me off. And I started really contemplating, like, there's a problem here. I can't really vocalize it, but this doesn't feel right anymore. And I started feeling like I was being led in a different direction. Like what I believe true Christianity or a Christ follower, is we're to love one another and serve one another. That's it. All that other stuff really doesn't matter. And I just didn't see that happening. In fact, as a brother and sister of all of my Christian friends, in fact, I was alienated with on two different occasions, and felt completely separated and ostracized. And so it started really, really caused me some anxiety, caused me doubt, guilt, because, oh my gosh, maybe I'm not, what I'm supposed to be doing, and blah, blah, blah. Because there's a lot of guilt that comes with a lot of the religion too. But the two occasions we have a transgender child, and when we, made it public, that our child's name is now this, nobody said anything bad, but nobody said anything. Nobody came to us as parents and said, I can't imagine what you're going through. Can I help you in any way? That particular child had also been in psychiatric care for years, and a couple times had to travel outside the States without us, was in a lockdown facility for a suicide attempt. And nobody visited, nobody called to check on me. And Griff was deployed at the time. So all this talk about love your neighbor, serve your neighbor, I'm like, where is that? Where is that? So felt pretty deserted with that whole situation. That was over several years. And then the second situation was, I'm an athlete. I was a competitive female physique athlete, and I was fit shamed at church. I was asked to actually teach a group of women. I was not allowed to teach the men, but I was allowed to teach the women on what Christ said about taking care of our bodies and the example he was with keeping, eating good and making sure he rested, making sure that he walked everywhere. He did tens of thousands of miles on foot for his ministry. But our church is having potlucks with all this garbage food, and half the people in our church were grossly overweight and obese. So I was asked to talk about how Christ is our example of health and fitness and how we should be taking care of our bodies and revere our bodies. But then on the flip side of that, I wasn't allowed to teach it to men, which that's a huge contention for me. If God's word is God's word, I should be able to tell it to anybody. But the second thing was within a few weeks of me teaching that class or that whatever workshop that day, I had an elder of the church put an anonymous note in the offering plate that said, "Can you ask the piano player to put more clothes on? I have a pornography addiction and she's distracting me from my worship." The problem with that is I was not inappropriately dressed at all. I was in a tank top and some casual khaki.
I don't even think it was a tank top. It was the cap top.
Cap top. But it was, and I was asked to put a hoodie on. So and in Germany, it's cold in the morning and it gets really warm towards the afternoon, especially when you pack hundreds of people into a warehouse building that does not have AC. And as soon as that sun hits that warehouse, it gets nice and toasty. It's an oven. And my question to them, and I did as I was asked because I wasn't going to let my team down. It wasn't about me. I was going to make sure that I was there for the worship team and for the congregation. This problem that this person had with me and the person that asked me to cover up, deal with that later. So I went to them and I said, what if that man, well, first I asked, was I dressed inappropriately in any way, shape, or form? And they're like, no. But it's our responsibility to not lead others into temptation.
But there was 3 other women in tank tops on the stage too.
So other ministry leaders were wearing the same type of attire. But my question to them was, if that man had a child pornography addiction and he had asked for every parent to remove their children from the sanctuary because he was distracted from his worship, would you have made the parents remove their children? And they said, no, that's different. And I know that this is like a one church thing. I know this doesn't, but we're a cross section, the military families are a cross section of the United States. And that belief system, I believe, there's a lot of hypocrisy. And it's not just in that particular situation. There's a lot of hypocrisy in others too. So I stepped down from the worship team and eventually left the church. I did not feel that the love and service was actually sincere and godly.
Now, do you think that is more of a problem of Christianity as a whole, or do you think there's a distinction between what is labeled as Christianity and what is intended to be practiced as Christianity? If that makes sense.
I think the religious organizations are responsible for that because they are a business. It's not about faith. When you have a mega church and you have, millions of dollars of revenue coming into your church, that's not the church. I don't believe, let me rephrase that. I don't believe that's the church that Christ intended.
I'm not even sure Christ intended a church.
We're the church.
Yeah.
And that's why I think there's, I just started seeing the cracks in all of that. And then, in recent years, traveling and experiencing different cultures, different faiths, different histories, different everything has continued to kind of, with that, kind of being thrown in my face with those experiences, and then getting to see some other views of spirituality and faith and culture and everything has really made me take a whole new look at everything. But I do believe our religious institutions are way off. They're way off. I think there's good people with really great hearts and really good intentions that are trying their best. But I think it's just a poison that eventually creeps in.
That herd mentality. You belong to the clique, you belong to the club. You start believing and following it.
Bikers.
Yeah, just like being a biker. If I'm an outlaw biker, growing up, that's what I wanted to be. That's what I knew. And there's that instant brotherly love. I can show up. I know how to behave in that situation. They're going to love me. I'm going to love them as long as I'm fitting that model. And I see that in church, that it's really no different. I got to show up, fit the model, sing the hymns, say I'm doing these things. And then if you want to get even more cliquey, then you start getting into the Wednesday night Bible clubs, right? those people, they're super tight. I see how they treat other people when they're not part of them, and I just watch all of that, and it's just not a healthy, positive environment that is what Christianity is preached to be. I just don't see it in action.
It's interesting that you use the phrase Bible club as opposed to like Bible study. And I think that speaks volumes as to what your experience is. We're not there to study the word. We're there to kind of reinforce our belief system by pulling out the verses that support that. Why a woman can't wear a tank top in church, because we're not supposed to, tempt others to sin. Well, aren't we also not supposed to sin? So whether the temptation is there or not, it's still on us not to sin.
Yep.
Yeah. I understand you don't flaunt it in front of somebody, and you don't go up, somebody has a porn addiction, and you don't, buy them copies of whatever the porn magazines are now. I don't know. Because I don't have that addiction, but not judging anybody that does. But, it's still on us to be responsible for the demonstration of our faith. It's not on somebody else to, necessarily support or, tempt us in our faith. So I agree with you. I think it's an interesting choice of words when you call it a Bible club instead of a Bible study.
I didn't even, a little Freudian slip, I didn't even realize I'd said that. But you hit on something too with, reinforcing your own beliefs and the verses, right? So you go to church and it's like the same 10 Bible verses that they always talk about. They don't really do much else. There's key ones and usually some financial piece in it, but it's always these same 10, but you never get into all the other things. I forget, I don't know which book it is, but, the Old Testament, you can beat your slaves within an inch of their life. As long as they don't die today, that's okay. Nobody talks about all these other things. And we know that this book has been rewritten over the years. Anybody that's taken a, Western history civilization class, they know how it's been rewritten, passed on by monks, been, parts of it have been, I don't want to use a bad word, but bastardized over the years to create that narrative for whatever the government or the leader or the king was at the time to enforce those policies. So it's, you guys have this belief, Christians, sorry, I don't want to be personal attack here. Christians have this belief that it's, the inherent word of God, but it's been touched by man the whole time. So there's not a way that it can really truly be the word.
Yeah, that's a hard one to really get a head around sometimes, because when you are a believer, it's kind of like, well, I want to be a little bit defensive there, but, I know where you're coming from. And I think the issue is that we as Christians, I'm going to use that term loosely because I think it does get used pretty loosely, is that we tend to come into it with our own beliefs, and we look for the things that support our beliefs rather than allowing the scripture to challenge those beliefs and challenge our circumstances. And, there's a book that was written, several thousand years ago, and it was written to a population very, very different than today. And yet we still want to, in certain situations, pull out the stuff that is, okay, well, this fits my situation. So, so having a transgendered child, that's horrible, that's wrong, it's a sin, and this and that. But, I'm going to put pepperoni on my pizza, I'm going to have bacon for breakfast, even though it says don't eat bacon or pork. So we really get kind of selective in what we think God's telling us to do or not to do. And I think it really needs to be a personalized book, and whether, whatever version you're reading, it should speak to us personally, not speak to us from a standpoint of supporting our beliefs or having others' beliefs kind of crammed down our throats. So I'm kind of with you on that there.
Yeah. And I think go ahead.
I was going to say, I tend to differentiate between big C, small c Christians, and, the small c Christians are the ones that maybe only show up at Easter and Christmas time. But even within the big C Christians, you can have those very distorted views of who and what Christ was or is and what he intended for us to do in practice of his teachings. And so I lean more into being a follower of Christ, which means I'm not Christ. I'm not leading like Christ. I'm probably being dragged behind, doing a very poor job, kind of the Wayne's World, I'm not worthy kind of thing. But, it's the intent is to take those principles, those teachings, and do my best to live those, regardless of what other people are doing. And it's not my point to judge what somebody else does or does not do with those beliefs. It's my job to do the best I can in the circumstances I'm in and be better tomorrow.
And I think the overall point of the Bible, right, is to be good, treat other people well, the 10 Commandments, don't covet thy neighbor, really be good to each other. So let me ask you, as an atheist, it's easy for me to go, I'm just going to live a good life and do good things and be good to people. Why do you feel the desire to have to follow this book?
That's a really, really good question. I don't know that I can really answer that. It's to me, it's much more of a pull that, I guess in part it's because, I was raised in that direction. It could be very different if I was raised Jewish or Islamic or Hindu or something like that. But for me, I recognize the life of Christ and what it signifies and what it's telling us to do. And so to me, it is more of I don't want to say a philosophy because I don't think of it as a philosophy. I do think there's a certain faith that goes along with it. But for me, it's this desire to really have that relationship with the creation, with the universe, which means, whether I define that as a God, some old white male sitting on a throne in heaven, or, some other, energy source, whatever it might be, to me, it doesn't matter precisely what God is, because I think God is always going to be bigger than I can perceive. And so I have to do the best with the circumstances I'm in to kind of paint a picture of understanding that helps me and helps others the best now, and just try and, emulate a better relationship. And so when I see, why I remain a Christian is because I see this historical figure of Christ who kind of exemplifies the perfect blending of the physical and the spiritual. And the more I kind of study this stuff and the more I kind of get into understanding the spiritual and the physical as foundational parts of our well-being, our health, and our longevity, and just our social connections and all that, the more I kind of see that Christ is the epitome of that, he's reported to be holy God and holy man. And what's that mean to be holy God, holy man? I'm physical. I have this physical body. I'm a product of, creation, nature, whatever it might be. I have a responsibility to that physical nature, but there's something greater than me that connects all of us. And the more I look at like quantum physics and exercise physiology, which exercise physiology being my field, the more I study human function and performance and all that, the more it leads me to a desire to understand the spiritual and how we are connected. We're separated not only by a computer right now, but by how many states between Oregon and Colorado. But I breathe out CO2. I breathe in oxygen. That's carbon, that's oxygen, the hydrogen molecules. Those all go into my being. They create me, the physical me. But then when I breathe that stuff out, it mixes in the universe. Who's to say that what was part of me months ago didn't make its way to Colorado and got breathed in through one of you, or, consumed through the carbohydrates of the proteins of foods you're eating? We're all this connection. And, the physical, the more we study like quantum physics or astrophysics, the smaller and smaller the physical gets, or the bigger and bigger it gets. The universe is just, we know the universe is growing, expanding, but the smaller we get, there's still space in between that. And what is that space? What is that energy that kind of connects us all? And so to me, I don't feel I need a God per se, but I need an understanding of our universal connection and our universal purpose. And for me, the example of Christ just fits that the best. And not to be said, that you can't draw from Buddhist teachings or Judaic teachings or even Islamic teachings or, Taoism, all these different religions. I mean, Native American spirituality. I mean, I've read some things on that, and it's like, well, this is not that different. It's just a different perspective of, God. And if we're looking at, God being bigger than self, whatever viewpoint we are kind of born with and kind of develop into is really just a glimpse of what it is. And so we may develop that as fully as we possibly can, but somebody just moved a few degrees to our left or right is going to have a very different viewpoint. And so I don't know. I just, it's important to me to have faith because I know what it's like not to have it. And I've told this probably a couple times already on this podcast, but when I was an undergrad, I was actually a geology major. And as a geology major and someone who was raised Christian, and I went through a lot of different churches. I mean, we can do a whole podcast series on all the different churches that I've gone through, but just getting to college, I mean, I was, by the time I got to college, I'd already been baptized twice. I was baptized, as a Catholic at birth. My family became Mormon. I was baptized as a Mormon. Went to a Methodist church, didn't get baptized there because I was an older adult, but I've gone to, my aunt was a Lutheran, my grandparents were Methodist, been to Presbyterian church, I've been to all these different churches, and I get to college and, as anyone young man in college does, you start to kind of move away from all that. You're not getting up on Sunday morning and going to church. But I started to kind of feel more of that itch, that need for something more than just, partying on the weekends and sleeping in on Sundays. And yet I was a geology major and I'm learning about evolution. And I'm like, these can't coincide. I mean, we're taught in religion that it's a 7-day creation. How can there be evolution? And I kind of, my logical scientific self obviously accepted that there had to be, a longer process than just 7 years. And so you start thinking, well, then I have to reject my faith to accept this scientific perception. And, it was a struggle for me. And I ended up kind of going to the Bible. I picked up Genesis, started reading through Genesis, and it's like, wait a minute, this is the exact sequence of events that I learned about in geology. Maybe it's just not, a literal 24 hours like we talk about in our physical existence. And so that opened me up to being able to kind of build off of the faith that I had. And then I ended up going through and tried a bunch of different churches in college, landed in the Worldwide Church of God, which is the Seventh-day, not a Seventh-day Adventist church. I actually accepted the Sabbath, tried a Seventh-day Adventist church, but it was like, well, this isn't really what I'm looking for. And I just kind of was drawn to this Worldwide Church of God because it was founded by this guy, Herbert Armstrong, Armstrong, that's cool. I just kind of watched a program about him and it, kind of caught my attention because of the name, but just the teachings just kind of grabbed me at that point. And I ended up, attending that church for a while and then, met Pam, and that church was kind of shifting its gears and, just becoming a little bit different, and it just wasn't for me anymore. And then, so Pam and I started looking for churches, and, we tried a number of different churches in Michigan. We ended up going to Mars Hill Bible Church, which is, I don't know if you've ever heard of Rob Bell, depending on who you talk to in Christianity, he's either, great pastor or he's a heretic. And, just loved his message. It was a kind of broader, it was more that Christian message that I think we need to hear, where it's, like he'd talk about, people ask him, what about the gays? Are they welcome in your church? And he'd say, well, they can sit right down next to the rest of us sinners. And that was kind of his philosophy, and I really kind of enjoyed his teachings. And he did a tour where he spoke on, the topic was everything is spiritual. He actually did 2 tours with that, and there's videos on it. And I'm trying to think if I think we did see the tour live once, but seeing the videos, it's just he takes you from the smallest of physical creation up to the greatest, and it's just like, okay, this is where I'm at right now spiritually and in my faith. And then, we left Michigan. We tried to find something similar here in Oregon, just never did. Went through a bunch of different churches. And now I kind of joke I identify as a Presbyterian. But, I don't think it matters to me where I attend as long as I'm finding kind of that community and I'm learning to grow as a person and hopefully become better. And so a long answer to your question. I'm not sure why I need it, but I know I need it. But again, I also don't think that where I'm at right now is perfection. I don't think that I could say that I have the absolute truths because I don't believe that we can comprehend the absolute truth. And I accept that, there's going to be error in my teaching or my belief system or my learning. And so it's up to me to find out what I don't know and to keep kind of growing in that and to respect that other people have a different picture of whatever we want to call God, the universe, the spirituality. We're all connected, but we're all seeing it kind of from a different view. And
That's what my dad used to tell me, and I think that just resonated from a very young age with me, is that he believed that every faith worshiped the same God, just in their own way, because of cultural, historical, differences. The United States we're still a very baby country compared to every other country in the world, pretty much, with the exception of our Native Americans. But he just believed that everyone views that deity or that person or that being just differently, but we all celebrate the same, God, or like you said, whatever you want to call that. And I think our recent trip just last year, actually, I think probably one of the first trips that really also resonated with me was our trip to the Vatican, and just understanding how Christianity, Griff kind of alluded to this earlier, that Christianity has been used for the murder of millions of people throughout the ages and control. Just absolute fear and control. And walking into the Vatican, it's a beautiful architecture. I can appreciate, the artistry and the history behind that. But knowing that villages were destroyed and pillaged and people were murdered for that gold and for all those precious jewels that are in there and all the relics that are in there, for what? And that really disgusted me. And then our recent trip to Peru, we did a 10-day trek in the Andes Mountains. And our guide, the country is predominantly Catholic, but they were invaded. And all of their Incan temples and religious buildings and such were destroyed, so that they had to conform to Catholicism. Interestingly enough, I don't know the statistics, but our guide and many people that he knows embrace both. They do follow the Catholic traditions and teachings, but they still revere the Incan faith and spiritualism. And he did a cleansing ceremony, and they pay tribute to Pachamama, which is basically Mother Earth. And he was describing how they revere the underworld as knowledge, and that's represented by the snake. The earth is the puma, which is revered as, I think, just strength the snake is knowledge, and then the earth is strength and life. And then the heavens are represented by the condor, which is the afterlife, or where you are born. And then, so there's no good and evil. Like we think, hell is beneath us and by a snake. They view that as knowledge. And obviously ties in with Christianity. That was the tree of knowledge,
tree of life,
and that was not supposed to be partaken. So it was fascinating to me how you can still revere, that's how I view spirituality. Like, this is every human being, and there's this balance in their culture, in the Incan faith, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, that male and female were equal, old and young are equal, black and white, you need both. And it's this constant balance and reverence for both, for this extreme and this extreme. And there's a balance, and both are needed to make sure that we're complete. and to not be lazy, to work hard and to be honest, and all of the traits that embody Christian, the Christian faith. It's everywhere. And I, kind of like with the Bible being passed through hands and hands and hands, I do not believe that is the inerrant word of God. I believe there are significant truths and amazing things in there, and I think there's some great stories that have been passed along, but I believe they've been embellished. So I feel like I just have to I have to let my God speak to me and direct my path, direct my life, direct my service, direct my love, direct my, my nature, my character, everything that I am, because I do want to be that person that's deserving of, my Creator's love, So it's just kind of, with all the history that we've been privy to, and different cultures and people that have, generations have been passed down some of these beliefs. It was absolutely beautiful. It was so moving. And that's when I came back from Peru. It was a life-changing experience for me. And I've never used that term in anything I've ever done. But that was truly life-changing.
Mary and Griff?
That was pretty cool too.
This was a positive experience.
Oh, okay.
But I think you really appreciated just the reverence for nature and their community like that.
Yeah, their Incan belief system is, like I said, very similar, but it's just, more fits in with me. Just be good to each other, protect the earth, live a good life, do good things. Looking at the Catholic Church, and how the Spaniards went down there and just decimated them, and if they didn't become Catholic, they were executed. Same thing here in the U.S., right? All of our Native Americans had all these Catholic schools popped up. They're beaten by these nuns, into submission to become Christian. For what? That's where I really struggle with Christianity. And, Muslims are the same. It's not just Christians. Religion has been used as a way to be coercive and control people. And I still see that today. It's still controlling our government. I don't really consider myself conservative or liberal. I'm kind of in that middle ground, but part of us being founded was separation of church and state. But you see all these laws now that are being put into place and restrictions on people based on Christian fundamental beliefs, not the freedom of religion that we're supposed to have. Look at abortion. Regardless what your view is on abortion, that's another podcast, not this one. But our government getting involved based on Christian beliefs that, where life begins, that's not a scientific thing. It's a Christian thing on, those timelines. What's viable, what's not, you're a scientist, you know kind of what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah.
So that's where I struggle with how the church is still controlling people and impacting people's lives.
Two of the most impactful verses for me are ones you hear of the least in Christian circles. And one is, John 3:17. We always hear John 3:16. Just watch a sporting event. There'll be somebody there holding up John 3:16. But, it's John 3:16. It says, God so loved the earth that he gave his only begotten son. But in John 17 is where he says, "Did not come to condemn the world, but to save the world." And yet we so often want to condemn people and say, you're condemned, you're going to hell, you're doing all this, unless you follow me. And that's not ever what Christ said was, I'm not condemning you. Look at who he hung out with. He hung out, one of his closest friends was a prostitute. And, he hung out with the tax collectors and all that other kind of stuff. He was not about condemning people. He was about changing lives and upsetting the current religious structure to get people, being more other-centered, being more, godlike, be more Christ-like.
Reach out to people in need, the poor, the widows, the lepers.
Yeah.
And that's where I just don't see people that claim to have a faith. I don't see them doing that. In fact, you take a look at any Facebook community page and you see the absolute worst in people. I think that was another stark reality for us when we moved back to the United States in 2019 after living abroad. And, Europe is just, the town that we lived in was founded in like the 700s. I mean, that's how long our little tiny village we lived in had been around. We go back to the United States in 2019. 5 months after we got here, it was an election year and COVID. And while there were, like I said, I do believe there are just incredibly amazing people that truly are servants, that truly have a heart to love their neighbor, but there's a lot that didn't. And we saw some of the worst of our country, our people, our neighbors. And it was disgusting, and it was terrifying. It made us feel like we didn't want to be here. You know, you didn't see that neighborly love and care and concern. You just saw, you just didn't see it. I don't know how even to describe it.
Just like a trivial example is, we're in Colorado, we get quite a bit of snow. And you see the people, they get up, they go to church every Sunday, but they won't shovel their sidewalk so people can get to the mailbox, And you approach them about it, and they get all offended. Don't tell me what to do, it's my yard. We need to clear the sidewalk so,
our elderly neighbors can get there safely. But it's such a self-serve, I think the United States as a whole is a very self-serving culture. It's about us. We don't think about our neighbor. We don't put other people first. It's me first, and then if I have capacity, then I'll see if I've got time. Just in friendships and relationships. I don't know if you've seen the conversation between Trevor Noah and Simon Sinek about friendship, and how are we actually showing up as a friend. 20 minutes worth your time. And one of the most poignant things he said is, we will cancel our friends for work any day, but we will not cancel work to be there for a friend. And that has been one of my challenges personally this year, is I will be present and I will show up for my friends. Work will be there. The world's not going to stop turning because I don't make a meeting or I miss a phone call. My friend's life may depend on that visit that day. We've lost too many friends to suicide and mental illness, and our own children struggled with that. That to me takes priority, but we don't. Our job is our priority, our work, our status, our title, our degree, our whatever. And we are so self-serving. That's not the Christ-like example. It wasn't about him. It was about, how can I love this person? How can I take this person out of their pain? How can I just hug them and comfort them for a minute? How can I, teach people that this person's not what you think they are? And we don't take enough time to do that. And that's where I see the hypocrisy of religion and faith. But when you look at that spiritual, we're part of something bigger, and we need to protect that thing, And I think if more people would do that, it could be so different. It could be so different.
Yeah. And the second verse that I was going to bring up was the one, and I can't remember exactly where it is, which is horrible. That's how much I've been doing my Bible club lately. But but there's the verse where people come to Jesus and say, basically they're saying, look at all these things we did in your name. We healed people and we did this and that. And he's like, who are you? I don't know you. Why do you call me Lord, Lord? And to me, that particular verse is saying, you might think you are the best Christian in the world, but Christ may not know you. So, it's about what you really do. It's not about just that you proclaim that he is your Lord and Savior. He's got to actually, you got to live, you got to walk the talk. If he died on a cross for us, then, like you said, Sandy, going to work instead of caring for a friend whose life might be in danger, you're not acting like Christ, And so regardless of religion, that principle needs to be at the core of our hearts and our lives. And I'm not there. My kids will tell you, they question, really, you're a deacon in the church? How can that be? And I'm going to be more critical of myself than anybody. So that verse scares me. If there is a salvation and it's based on, being a follower of Christ, and, am I doing what I'm supposed to be doing? I would wager to guess that I'm not. And so to me, my salvation, and I think that's a problem. One of the problems with Christianity is that it's based on personal, we base it so much on personal salvation. And I don't think that's the way Christianity is intended, the way it's supposed to be preach. So it's kind of my big C, small c kind of Christian, not Christ follower Christian. That, it's not about saving ourselves. It's about saving others. Jesus could have gotten down off the cross, right? But he didn't. Yeah. He went ahead and died. And so whether or not it's the religion, whether or not it's how we are to live our lives, it's how we're to live our lives, but whether or not it is, why the Bible was written, any of that kind of stuff, it really comes down to what is the point of having this belief system. It's not so that I can be saved. It's so that, the world is a better place.
And it's not just about doing, acts without faith is worthless, in the Bible context. But are we doing things because it's the right thing to do and because we actually love our neighbor? Or are we doing it to humble brag? Mm-hmm. I see way too much of the latter, and it's all, oh, God bless me with the opportunity to help this family. Great. But that's between you and your creator, your God. Why are you telling me? It shouldn't be that important that you feel like you have to tell me. I think that's another, versus the spirituality piece when we were in Peru, is that you see all of they one of their things is they offer coca leaves to Pachamama, and they dry these leaves, and you'll see them all over where people have just taken a moment to give thanks. And it's a private thing. It's not, I don't have to announce all the good deeds I did. I don't have to, humble brag and give glory to God, but it's about me. It's still about, like when you do that, it's to put the spotlight on you. But if I mention God, then it makes it okay. And that's what I think of when I see some of these other faiths and some of these other cultures that have their spirituality in a much different place. It's very private, but it's because they truly revere and they truly respect and love and are in awe of their creator or their deity or their God or their person. And I think that's what we lack. I think if more people would really take a good hard look and delve into that space, things could be very different as well.
What do you think, Griff? What do we have to change in the world?
We need to bring
what is our major spiritual problem we have to fix?
We need to bring a sense of community back. If I could fix one thing, it'd be that.
And how do you define a sense of community?
Just, being neighborly, being willing to help out, being courteous to each other. We've lost in the U.S. I believe that we've lost that.
If you look at tithing, and I think this is because we had a lot of conversation about tithing, and in the Bible was, you leave the outside of your crop for the aliens and the widows. You don't mow down that little edge that it's not usually the best. It's usually the scraggly things, but they wanted to make sure that everyone, no matter if they belonged to that community or were passing through, or the widows that didn't have a husband take care of them, would have something. The tithing was for community celebration. The tithing was to make sure that there was enough stores for the winter so that that community wouldn't perish. And that's not what tithing is anymore. And that's not what community is anymore. We don't take care of the people in need anymore. We don't reach out to our neighbors and have conversation and know that they're going through a rough time or they went through a divorce. All of a sudden, poof, there's a moving truck and what happened? We don't do that.
And even in our little neighborhood, when we first moved here, we went door to door, 20 houses up and down each side, inviting people over just to come meet us. People wouldn't even open their doors. You could hear the TV inside. You could hear them talking. They wouldn't even do the courtesy to open the door to say thank you or no thank you.
You could hear them yelling at their dog to quit barking at the door, but they wouldn't come to the door.
Shut up or they won't go away.
And we're clearly not like peddlers. So even on a Ring camera, it should have been fairly obvious that we're not trying to sell, solar panels or new roofs. So
we actually lived in a community in Michigan that it was a really, really nice, close-knit community. And like my wife moved there first because we got the house before we got married. I was still finishing up my job at Eastern Michigan. She was already in Holland, Michigan. And so she was at the house early. And I'd come up on the weekends and I'd shovel the walk when I got there. But there were so many times it was already done. And there were times she'd come home from work and the driveway would be clear. And she thought, well, maybe they just, they forgot to turn off the service that came and plowed the driveway. And this went on for weeks because it snows all the time in Michigan, like you guys know in Colorado. And finally, I think she came home one day early or something, and a neighbor was out snow plowing our driveway. And so she figured out that he had been doing it. And, she asked if she could pay him. Or no, I just, I enjoy doing it. I'm doing my own driveway, so I might as well do yours. And, it wasn't about, anything. I mean, we barely knew her. It was just the neighborly thing to do. And, we had a woman across the street, her husband that passed, and, I'm mowing our lawn. I'm off in the summertime. It's like, it's not a big deal for me to mow her lawn. Of course, I'd piss off the other neighbors because I was so meticulous about my lawn. I had to have the striping. And it wasn't really pissing them off, but they'd laugh about it. I would mow my lawn and then go over and mow her lawn, and the lines would have to line up. So stand in her driveway or her yard, you look over to my yard, the lines are going to be perfect. It was just kind of my OCD. But we had another neighbor across the street that, hey, when we moved in, it's like, I keep my garage door unlocked. If you ever need any tools or anything, just help yourself. Just, make sure they get back. And there was so much of that in that community that was really a special community. And you don't see it quite as much. We were lucky. We had a house that had a big wraparound porch plus a back deck. And so, we'd sit out and you'd interact with the neighbors all the time. And it was kind of a double cul-de-sac and kids would be out playing. And it was just, this is what community is supposed to be. It's not supposed to be us locked in our houses, looking at our ring to see if, we know the person at the door or not, and, hiding, not answering. You remember when we didn't have cell phones, we used to, phone would ring. There was no caller ID. We'd be excited and we'd run to pick it up to see who was calling. Now it's like, oh, I don't know this number, deny, and you don't pick it up. And
or either. I'll text you first.
What's that?
Hey, are you home? Like, I just won't go knock on your door anymore either. I'll text you first. Hey, are you home? You mind if I stop by?
Yeah, we have to change. And it doesn't go back to religion because I think, it doesn't matter what denomination your neighbor is. And, I've told this story a few times on this podcast and others that my dad's, one of his favorite comedians is Emo Phillips. And I don't know if you ever seen Emo. He had kind of this weird haircut and he was kind of this squirrely little guy, really funny guy. But he does this whole bit where he's walking on the Golden Gate Bridge and he sees this guy up on the ledge ready to jump and goes over and, says, why are you trying to kill yourself? And, it comes up, do you believe in God? Well, I believe in God too. Are you a Christian? Yes, I'm a Christian too. And they go back and forth and it's like, oh, you're a Baptist? I'm a Baptist too. Northern or Southern Baptist? And he said, I'm a Southern Baptist. Oh, me too. And they keep going down to where it gets down to like, I don't know, it's like the different synods and all that kind of stuff. And then it's like, oh, are you of, the charter of whatever year or the charter of this? And he says the charter and he says, heretic, and he pushes him off the bridge. And it's kind of like where we are in our, religions now is like we look so much to the differences rather than the commonalities. And, it's no surprise that people like yourself, Griff, are just like, I'm so turned off from Christianity that, I'm going to label myself as an atheist. I'm not sure I would truly label you as an atheist. I think there's a little bit of a belief in a higher power kind of sense in there, but it's not like a defined God. And so by definition, I guess that does technically make you a atheist because you don't have a God per se. But, I think we oftentimes as religious people look at people who are atheists and say, well, they're just, they have no sense of, there's no belief, there's no principle there. They're insert whatever denomination wants to paint atheist as. And
what's really funny is most of the people and friends that we know that are atheists are some of the most generous, kind-hearted, amazing people you'll ever meet. Yeah. And I think that's why.
Yeah, and so I'm glad you guys came on today. I wanted to have you on. I mean, when the topic first came up, I mean, hopefully I would have had you on like in the first couple episodes, but Griff, you're too shy. And so it took a while. But, that's what I want in this podcast is, we're looking at, spiritual problem. We're not looking at a problem with people not having religion or being religious or too religious, not religious enough. It's that at the underlying issues that we are facing as humanity are something greater than ourselves. And until we start really looking at there is something greater than ourselves, and that something might just be the other people. The universe is bigger than ourselves. We're not at the center of the universe. Last I noted the earth, sun don't revolve around me. It revolves around the sun. And so we have to really take life from that perspective. And it's great that you both came on. I mean, that wasn't what I initially kind of envisioned when, we talked about having Griff on. But having the two of you on and having, both of you having experiences in the world that have distanced you from what would be traditional religious faith. And yet, what was that, a cattail there?
She thinks she's the star.
Yeah. Well, see, cats can't be spiritual because they think they know they are the center of the universe.
They are the center of the universe.
But then again, dogs are God spelled backwards. So think about that. They're the most loyal. But, I think it's important that we encourage people to broaden their views and be accepting and eventually maybe get to that point where, we're not asking, what's your religion? Who's your God? Because we should be able to see who your God is, right? And it's big C God, small c God, big G God, small g God. I tend to capitalize God. I use all caps, that kind of small caps when I type it, just because I want to underscore that what I'm saying is God is something beyond my capacity to fully understand. And so whether, we look at it and say, I don't understand it, or I don't think it can exist because it's too beyond comprehension or just doesn't present itself to me is far better than saying, no, I know exactly what God looks like and who he is. And, and again, it's that big capital H, he. And, we can identify characteristics when, and essentially, what did God say? God said he's defined himself as I am and love. Other than that, and we just, it'll be when this airs 2 episodes prior to this one. So it's episode 19 of this podcast. The title is God is, and I put in parentheses love because originally it was kind of God is love, but we went beyond it. It's not just God is love. He's bigger than just the love itself or chi or whatever you define God as. And again, it's God is beyond understanding. And then the rest is commentary that, where we want to come together as community is, okay, well, what is your perception of God or a lack of God? And how do we work together to make this, spinning blue ball a better place? And I think hopefully we did that a little bit in this conversation today.
I think we did. I think the one takeaway I would like to leave with is get to know me first before asking which church I go to. That shouldn't be the first question. Get to know Griff. Right. Don't start with, welcome to town. Which church are you going to? Get to know me. I just want to know you. We can get there later, but let's just know each other. That's something we took away from Germany. In America, we lead with my job. What do you do? Oh, this is what I do. Germany, you don't ask that question. You don't ask what they do for a living. You don't ask about their job. You get to know the person. May come up later, but it's considered rude to ask them that because they want to get to know me, not because of my job.
Yeah.
And something else that's come up a few times recently on this podcast and elsewhere is, the tendency that we have as Americans to walk up to people and say, how you doing? But not one, we freak out if they start answering the question. We don't want to know how you're doing. It's just a greeting. It's like saying hi. It's just, how you doing? And just keep walking by. And I first had that pointed out to me from a former student that was from Chile. In South America, if you ask somebody how they're doing, you're waiting for a response. Yeah, and I think we need to get to that too. Yeah.
Yeah. It all goes back to that sense of community and love for each other.
Yeah. So until we can get that community, that sense of love your neighbor, then again, religion is all commentary, and we don't need to be dealing with it. We don't need to be asking, Griff, where do you go to church? And be offended if you say you don't go to church.
Yeah,
or, well, you should start, you should come over to my church. We have a great Bible club on Wednesday nights.
That may be the title of this podcast, Bible Club.
Yeah. Go to Bible club and I talk about my neighbors. We were talking at Bible club the other night about Sandy's, trashy dress and when she's leading the music. So, I should have ended right with your statement about, what you just said there, but we'll give Sandy the last word on today's episode. So, Sandy, how do you want to leave us with today? Something profound to just, because I can't do the whole, what do you, and age well kind of thing like I do in the other podcast. So this one, I just kind of try and leave just on something to ponder. So,
yeah, I don't think it's even profound. I think it's the basic, most simple thing is just be a servant and love one another. If we can just do those two things, I think us as a human race would just change the world. Love one another, serve one another. That's it.